Before we explore our next two file folders, let's quickly review our mental filing system. It all starts with the number 7 with a dash through the stem. Surround it with C, S, and J. Expand that to C, 4, 3, S, and J, which becomes C, 4 people, 3 societies, S, and J. Keeping in mind our mnemonic clues, a judge must judge, and ark, expand that fully to creation, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, anarchy, royalty, captivity, silence, and Jesus. Our timeline moves to about 1500 BC. Keep in mind that all the dates in the Bible basically are heavily rounded. The Moses folder appears as the third in the group of 4 great people. We'll add 6 items to his folder. After centuries of bondage, the patriarch Moses repeatedly approaches the Pharaoh to beseech him, "Let my people go." But Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and it is only after Moses calls down a series of devastating plagues on Egypt that the Pharaoh finally releases the Israelites. Moses leads the masses of Israelite slaves out of Egypt. According to many scholars, there were perhaps 2 million people who left bondage. This mass migration to freedom is chronicled in the book of Exodus, and Exodus is our first entry in the Moses folder. The Israelites crossed what is traditionally called the Red Sea. However, many scholars call it the Sea of Reeds, or Yam Suf. It was a body of water on the border between Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, called the Bitter Lakes in later centuries. This wetland was located in the same region as today's Suez Canal, which transfers cargo to every corner of the world. God allows Moses to lead the people through those waters on dry land, while Pharaoh's Egyptian forces pursued them. The Egyptians were drowned as the waters returned to their normal levels following the Israelites' crossing. Once safely on the other side, Moses turns southward toward Sinai. Eventually, they arrive at Mount Sinai, deep in the Sinai Peninsula. Remember from your map in Lesson 2 that the mountain is between the rabbit's ears. Today, it is still a land of extreme desolation and austere beauty. It's here that God spoke to the people through his first prophet, Moses. It's where he gave them the law, the Torah, as it is known in Hebrew. And Sinai is the second entry in our Moses folder. God, also known as Yahweh, issues his law to Moses in 3 sections: the moral, the civil, and the ceremonial. The moral part of the law we know as the 10 Commandments. Much of our present common law system is based on those 10 simple constructs. The civil part of the law spells out by divine regulation how the people are to live with one another and to settle disputes. In the ceremonial part of the law, God instructs his people how to go about worshiping him in the desert tabernacle and later in the great temple to be built in Jerusalem. The complex rituals required in the new form of worship also prefigure future relationships between men and the coming Messiah. We'll find out more about the law as the Bible basically study moves forward. At this point, the Israelites don't know that they are in for 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. God is preparing them for that time with a set of simple rules that will ensure their survival during the difficult nomadic years to come. The 3 parts of the law, moral, civil, and ceremonial, are delivered directly to Moses from the hand of God at the top of Mount Sinai. The moral, the civil, and the ceremonial. Remember that order with these letters, M, C, C, the third entry on the Moses folder. Moses organizes the tribes, leading them northward toward a resting place at Kadesh Barnea. This ancient oasis still exists in present-day Egypt, not far from the border with Israel. The Israelites establish a camp and await God's next direction for the northward movement back to the land of Abraham. To get there, they must travel through the harsh wilderness of the Negev and the Sinai. Kadesh Barnea appears as the fourth entry on the Moses file folder. Finally, after more than 400 years of bondage, the people are on their way back to the promised land of their forefathers, the land promised to Abraham, his son Isaac, and his son Jacob. While resting at Kadesh Barnea, all the tribes of Israel camped out in an ordered formation around a tent of worship, the tabernacle, built in the desert according to God's specific directions in the ceremonial part of the law. God sends a command to Moses to assign a representative from each of the 12 tribes of Israel to go out and explore the land of Canaan. Moses had questions and needed dependable answers. What was the land like? Were there rivers and springs? What kind of people were living there? Were there farmlands? Was there food available for all his people? Moses instructs the 12 men to go into Canaan to spy out the land. They traveled northward as far as today's southern Lebanon. Along the route, the spies discovered a fertile and beautiful land filled with enormous potential. However, they discover the land is heavily populated by small tribes and kingdoms, the Canaanites, Edomites, Moabites, and other tribal groups and clans. The Israelites will have to contend with these people when they prepare to enter the land and subdue it under God's direct command. The 12 spies return to report their findings to Moses at Kadesh Barnea. There are two sharply different reports. 10 of the spies report that the land is rich, filled with milk and honey, but it is also filled with a population of enormous strength. They say that the land is filled with giants. These 10 do not believe the Israelites can go in and subdue the land as God has instructed. Their advice? Turn back to Egypt and be done with all plans for conquest. However, the two remaining scouts, Joshua and Caleb, sharply disagree with the majority conclusion. They agree that the land is fertile and desirable, and that the people occupying the land are formidable and will not leave quietly. They remind the people that God is with them and that the land can be subdued with His help. But the people choose not to believe God's promise to protect and to provide for them. Most of the Israelites support the 10 spies who urge a return to Egypt. They are too fearful and therefore are disobedient to God's specific plan and promise. In response, Moses does not give the command to enter the land and subdue it. The trip into the land is canceled for the time being. As a result of their disobedience and their lack of faith, God sends the Israelites into the desert wilderness to wander for 40 years. Hence, our fifth entry on the Moses folder, the number 40. They lived a hard-scrabble, nomadic life in the parched land south of Canaan until almost everyone of the disbelieving generation died off. Joshua and Caleb, the scouts who urged the people to trust God and enter the land, survived. At the end of the 40 years in the wilderness, Moses, who was reaching the end of his own life, brings the people to the region of Mount Nebo. Moses was able to view the promised land from that mountaintop, but due to his previous disobedience, he knew that God would not allow him to enter the promised land. God instructs Moses that the time has come for the Israelites to go into the land of Canaan to subdue it and to claim it as their own rightful inheritance. Before Moses dies, he delivers a series of 5 sermons near Mount Nebo. He reminds the Israelites of their law and the unusual heritage of their people. He speaks to the new and younger generation, instructing them about their God, about who they are, and about their unique national heritage and how they should live as they move into the Promised Land. These 5 sermons make up the book of Deuteronomy, which means second law. The 6th and final entry in the Moses folder is 5 sermons. At the end of his teaching, Moses issues the Great Land Covenant, a reiteration of God's promise to Abraham's descendants for all time. That land inheritance forms the core of the Middle East conflict to this very day. Note the LC scroll at the end of the Moses file folder standing for the Land Covenant. Deuteronomy 30, 1 through 10 describes God's unconditional promise to Israel. The land is to be Israel's inheritance in perpetuity. This promise amplifies or further explains the land portion of the Abrahamic covenant. Here is the very heart of that land covenant from Deuteronomy 30, verses 5 and 6. He will bring you to the land that belonged to your ancestors, and you will take possession of it. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. The Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love him with all your heart and with all your soul, and live. With this covenant, this further promise from God, we see an amplification of that first part of the Abrahamic covenant, the promise of a land. As Israel's future unfolds, the seed and blessing portions of the Abrahamic covenant will be amplified in even greater promises to God's chosen Old Testament people. But each promise is related to that original contract that God established with Abraham. Soon after Moses delivers his 5 sermons or discourses, he dies and is carried by God to an unknown burial site. This brings us to the last file folder of the 4 great people, Joshua. In the AJMJ series, the last J stands for Joshua, the great Israeli general. Joshua succeeds Moses as leader of the Israelites. Remember that he was one of the 2 faithful scouts who urged Israel to trust in God and enter and subdue the land. God made a further promise to Joshua. He would give him all the land, from the southern desert to Lebanon, and from the Euphrates River to the Mediterranean Sea, known as the Great Sea in ancient times. But that promise meant Joshua and the chosen people must first conquer all that territory. Joshua was instructed to go in and take possession of the land. To accomplish this, Joshua's armies had to cross the Jordan River and then subdue the Canaanites who lived throughout the Promised Land from the north to the south. General Joshua marshaled his forces from the highlands near Mount Nebo and prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. He leads the Israelites across the Jordan River near today's ancient city of Jericho. Once again, God holds back a flood of water, this time not the Sea of Reeds, but the Jordan River, allowing the people to cross on dry land. The Israelites then entered the land of Canaan, today's Israel, with the fertile valleys and plentiful water resources in the north, and the desolate and thirsty wilderness in the south. First, they conquered the principal cities of Jericho, followed by a difficult campaign against the city of Ai. The first 2 entries in the Joshua folder are the names of those cities, Jericho and Ai. For 7 years, Joshua's armies range up and down the land, winning hard-fought battles, contending with the enormous physical contrasts and challenges presented not only by the occupiers of the land, but by the landscape itself, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. In spite of all their efforts, Joshua's armies do not completely rid the land of all the Canaanites as God has instructed. This failure to completely obey God's directive later proves to be a great mistake, affecting the future development of Israel's national life. The Israelites have many military successes, and then, at the end of 7 years of Joshua's military campaigns, the land is finally subdued and divided among the 12 tribes of Israel, named for Jacob's 12 sons. Dividing that land among the tribes was no easy task. Each tribal unit or clan then settled down, ready to learn to live in the new land of Abraham's inheritance. Here is a map showing how the territory was divided. Asher, Zebulun, Naphtali, Issachar. The sons of Joseph became 2 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh's inheritance was on both sides of the Jordan River. Gad, Dan, Reuben, Simeon, Judah, and Benjamin. As for the tribe of Levi, they received no land inheritance. They were given only towns to live in, with pasture lands for their flocks and herds. The Levites were the priests of the tabernacle, and as Scripture says, "But to the tribe of Levi he gave no inheritance, since the food offerings presented to the Lord, the God of Israel, are their inheritance as he promised them." So the second and final entry in the Joshua folder is Land Divided. Keep in mind the approximate dates for these 2 men's lives and related events. The dates are easy to remember in broad groups of roughly 500 years for each major period. The stories of Abraham and Joseph occur around 2000 BC. Moses and Joshua's stories take place around 1500 BC. Again, we remind you that the dates in the Bible basically are all heavily rounded. Remember as we proceed that we're not concerned with details. We're only building a stable skeletal framework of the entire Bible based on its chronological storyline. The file folders and their individual component items are designed to help you form that mental framework on which all other biblical details have a firm location, a place, a mental map around which you can organize all of your biblical thinking. We're now halfway finished building the Bible file. We've completed the creation file, followed by the group of 4 people, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, and Joshua, together with the Abrahamic covenant and its first sub-covenant, the land covenant. In our next lesson, we'll look at the 3 societies, anarchy, royalty, and captivity.